Good morning. It is so good to be with you today. I missed you last week. I had a great time over at Bridge City, man. What's going on over there is so exciting, and it was fun to be a part of it. But I will say, I felt like I missed you guys, and it feels like I'm finally starting to feel like home here, which is really exciting. So good to be with you this morning. You know, it's been a fun weekend. We had a kind of a relaxing weekend at home, and my youngest daughter, Maddie, her newest obsession is The Swan Princess, which dropped on Netflix. If you remember that movie, it was made in the '90s or whatever. It was at the time competing with The Lion King, and The Lion King won. Um, but man, she's watched it probably 7 times this weekend, which means I've watched it like 7 times with her. And there's this one scene, it's kind of a ridiculous movie. There's a French frog named Jean Bob, and there's a puffin named Lieutenant Puffin, and it's kind of zany and all that. But there's this scene where Prince Derek, he's supposed to be like the romantic hero of the story. He tells Odette that the only thing he loves about her is her beauty. And she looks at him and says, "What else?" And Prince Derek looks to his mother and is like, "Well, what else? What else?" And then he finally says, "Well, what else is there?" And I kid you not, my 3-year-old Maddie looks at me and goes, "Oh no." It was like even she understood that Prince Derek was an idiot, right? But I thought it was fitting, this idea, the theme even throughout that movie as I'm preparing this sermon on this really, really challenging teaching that Jesus has for us in the book of Mark. And if you've been with us, we've been walking through the book of Mark, and sometimes you get to a passage like this and you'd be like, maybe we should skip this one. But I think it's an important one for us this morning. And really, what I want to do is take some time to get sort of underneath some of the challenges and the context in which it was written. But before I do that, would you join me in prayer? Lord, help us this morning understand this challenging teaching. Be with me and give me your words. May I decrease so you may increase. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So there's a tension here in the beginning of this text. And it's a tension if you've read the other Gospels, because there's something called the synoptic problem. And essentially what that is when you have the synoptic Gospels, which is Matthew, Mark, and Luke, these 3 Gospels are all very similar in structure, but there are differences. And when you encounter one of these differences, it makes you ask questions. Well, is this a contradiction? Does the Bible contradict itself? And it forces you to ask questions about context. It asks questions about authorship and who's writing to whom. And at the center of this problem, the difference between this account in Mark 10 and Matthew's account in Matthew 19, it centers around this live debate that was happening at the time. The Pharisees are referencing a live debate in the first century on how to interpret Deuteronomy 24. Deuteronomy 24 says, when a man takes a wife and remarries her and then finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes a certificate of divorce, et cetera, et cetera. So that word in the Hebrew, indecency in her, is what is debated. And there were 2 sort of famous schools of thought, 2 famous rabbis. You had the school of Shammai, and you had the school of Hillel. Shammai was the more conservative of the 2 and said that something indecent meant adultery and nothing else. That infidelity itself ruptures the one flesh union, but that was it. The school of Hillel, which was a more progressive, said that any and every reason, which scholars found that exact phrasing on many divorce certificates during Jesus' time. Hillel, the story goes that apparently you could divorce your spouse if she burnt dinner, right? If she cooked poorly, that was reason enough. In fact, there's even documentation to show that if you found a more beautiful woman, you could leave. Notice it doesn't say the opposite if you found a more beautiful man, right? Like it was a one-way street. Men could leave women if they found someone better. And during that time, Hillel's view dominated even in religious culture. Divorce was, believe it or not, roughly as common then as it is today. So some things don't change. And unlike today, it wasn't a 2-way street. Because women did not have legal standing, what would often be the case is when a man was tired of whoever it was he was married to or found someone younger or more beautiful, he would leave that person and there was nothing she could do. And often she was out a way to provide, out of a way to make money. And it was almost as if she was abandoned and put in a really, really hard position. And so, one more piece of context. If you were with us a month or so ago, I preached on the beheading of John the Baptist, which is another fun text. If you remember that one, in that story, John the Baptist is calling out Herod for his own divorce and remarriage. He's saying, you preach this one thing, but you are a religious hypocrite. But if you remember, it kind of captivated Herod in that moment. So the Pharisees are seeing all of this, and they're not asking this question in good faith. They are very much intentionally trying to trap Jesus here. And so it's a lose-lose, no matter how Jesus answers it. And they approach him and ask, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Which, again, not a genuine question. It's a test. In their culture, divorce heavily favored men. Women had no legal standing. The Pharisees wanted to endorse the status quo, wanted Jesus to endorse status quo. They were trying to get him to say what they wanted him to say. But Jesus doesn't take the bait. He does two things at once. He appeals to the creation order, right? He goes back to Genesis when God created, male and female, one flesh, what God has joined together, no one can separate. And in doing so, he's doing a lot of things. One of the things he's doing is he's advocating for the dignity of women who in that time were being abandoned and oppressed. And it is very, very countercultural for Jesus to make these kinds of claims. Now, here's where it gets a little tricky because Matthew's version of the same conversation includes what scholars call the exception clause. And I actually have a slide for this one as well to kind of help us understand the differences in the two different readings. Jesus permits divorce in cases of porneia. That's the Greek word for sexual immorality. That clause is in Matthew, but it's not included in Mark. So which one's right? What is Jesus saying? Is there any escape for someone who has who has had a divorce? Or do they need to remain in a marriage that perhaps includes adultery and abuse and abandonment or whatever? That's the question that people wrestle with. But here's the context I think is really important for us. It's almost certainly because Mark was actually writing to a different audience that we can interpret this passage a little bit differently. Scholars are almost unanimous on this, that Mark wrote to Roman Gentile Christians, likely in Rome itself, where Matthew wrote to Jewish Christians who were very much living within that Pharisaic Judaism, that debate that was going on. They would have known about the two schools of thought, the Hillel and Shammai debate, and they would have known exactly the grounds justified for divorce. And so Matthew's exception clause lands in that specific legal debate. There's a reason why it's there. Mark doesn't include it, not because he's contradicting Matthew, but because his Roman audience had a totally different set of assumptions and were asking different questions. Mark actually adds something that Matthew doesn't. He adds that a woman who divorces her husband and remarries commits adultery, which is interesting because under Jewish law, women could not initiate divorce. So Matthew's audience would have found that statement completely incoherent. But Mark is translating Jesus' teaching for people who need to hear it applied asymmetrically to both sexes. That was a lot. I hope you stayed with me to some degree, but you understand a little bit about what's happening here, and it's kind of a hermeneutic principle. It's just a fancy way of saying an interpretive challenge that we face when we read the Bible. That the Bible was written by humans, inspired by the Holy Spirit, meaning every single word belongs. But it was written to a specific set of people in a specific time. And if we can understand that context, it actually makes way more sense when we understand some of the differences in the Gospels. They're not contradictions. They're very specific contexts in which they're written. And so with that, what does this tell us? I think the teaching is shaped for different pastoral situations. Mark gives us the teaching in its most stark, most universal form, that marriage is a covenant that is written into the creation order, and divorce ruptures what God has joined. And in the Roman world, where women were being left and doing the leaving, both needed to hear that. And so this raises questions for us, and understandably so. Is adultery the only grounds? What about abandonment? People point to 1 Corinthians 7. What about abuse? Down through church history, there has been a running debate with no consensus but there are four main positions. And what I'm not trying to do here is say, this is our position. Our actually denomination has a brilliant position paper on this. You can find that on the EPC website. But I do want to just unpack these four positions because I think it'll help us frame up our conversation. So here are the four positions. The first is the official Catholic position, which is even if you are the wronged party, you may not remarry. You sort of bear that pain as a witness to kingdom life. The second position is that you may remarry only if your spouse was sexually unfaithful because they ruptured the one flesh union. The third position is that you may remarry for other serious reasons, abandonment, and most would add abuse to that conversation as well. And the fourth position is that all divorce at minimum is the byproduct of sin, but God forgives sin. And after genuine repentance and attempted reconciliation, if the former spouse will not return, you may eventually remarry under God's compassion. And so here's what I want to note about all four positions and what they have in common, is that all four positions and the basic shape of Jesus' teaching is the same here, that divorce is not an exit when the marriage becomes difficult. Marriage or divorce is not an exit when things get hard. Irreconcilable differences is not language you're going to see anywhere in the scriptures. It's not a biblical category. And if one was wanting to get a divorce simply because they've grown apart and then remarry, in God's eyes, that's the same thing as committing adultery. And that's not a comfortable teaching, but it's a teaching of Jesus, so we need to pay attention to it. And so I want to ask some questions underneath, because I think even in the conversation about divorce, we're making a statement about marriage. We're making a statement about what God has created for man and for women. And we're talking about marriage and love and sexuality, which is a very confusing thing in our culture. I think we can all agree that there's a lot of confusion out there and lack of clarity. And so what I'm committed to this morning, and what I'm going to attempt to do, is be remarkably clear as I can, but at the same time doing so with a ton of grace and compassion, because I understand there's a lot of sensitivity here. And I know many of you bring in your own baggage into this conversation. And that's part of what it means to be the church, is that we can come together and have these more challenging conversations. So let me start by naming our cultural moment. And this language comes from a guy named Mark Sayers. He's a pastor in Australia, but he has a really great understanding on the culture that we're in the West. He says there are 5 real cultural shifts that we need to reckon with, and that kind of point to part of the challenge that we're facing today. The first is that sex has been disconnected from childbearing and family. You know, interestingly enough, it was 1972 that contraceptives were legalized in America. If you think about that, prior to 1972, for most of human history, there was a risk involved, right? It was a possibility that you might have children. And that, with that possibility being removed, it in many ways changed the primary purpose from being procreation to pleasure. What makes you happy? The second shift is that it has been disconnected from marriage. Understand that marriage has been the cultural norm since the beginning of time, and not just in our culture, in all cultures. Marriage is a very a normal part of what it means to be human. And this has created a real fresh anxiety among people, because people are connecting the deeper emotional soul level of sexual intimacy, but without the long-term commitment. And that leads to a space that is unsafe. Number 3, sex has been disconnected from male and female relationships. It's interesting, we looking back, it really hasn't been that long since gay marriage has been legalized in the United States. It seems like it's been around forever, but for a moment, you have to consider that a man-on-man relationship or woman-on-woman relationship wasn't really a consideration until the 1980s. I mean, sure, it existed, but it wasn't talked about in the same way. And so because of that, the rapid change in our culture, especially on this issue, it's really hard to have a coherent conversation. Number 4, he says that sex has been disconnected from love and emotion and relational commitment of any kind. If you think about apps like Tinder, which are designed to have a relational connection or physical connection, but usually without strings attached, right? Just meet someone on a whim's notice, and that's it. And it's led to what a lot of modern sociologists call hookup culture. right? Where people are looking to hook up, but without any actual strings attached or any kind of commitment involved. There's a researcher by the name of Donna Frieda. She talks about how people are delaying getting married, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But a lot of it has to do with the fact that getting married requires commitment. It requires committing to someone. It requires possibly having children, which slows down your career and your advancement. And that age is being moved later and later and later. Number 5, and this is a new one, but sex is being disconnected from people altogether. There is a rapid change in the technology that we use through AI chatbots where people are developing vulnerable, emotional, and intimate relationships with AI technologies. And it's a scary thing. And it's a technology that really tells you what you want to hear, tells you the things that you want to hear about yourself, and there's no commitment needed from you to reciprocate. One article I read says you are free from all the responsibilities of an actual human relationship. Now, these 5 shifts, they're unique to us, but sexual brokenness is not new. You read about it all through the scriptures. You read about brothels, prostitutes, you read about sexual immorality, you read about infidelity, you read about marriage and lust. Jesus, who's a celibate single man, talks about marriage and lust as categories that he recognizes are part of what it means to be human. You see gay relationships and gender fluidity all throughout Greek mythology, so none of that is new. Maybe we have a different way of talking about it now. But here's what is new. While sexual brokenness isn't new, what's new is that more and more people point to these shifts as moral progress, as liberation, versus religion, gender roles, tradition now viewed as oppressive by the secular world. In a moral 180, progressives view the traditional view on marriage and sexuality as behind, whereas progressives have sort of a moral superiority and a need to fix those more oppressive views. Maybe you felt that or experienced that on some level. But I think it begs the question, who's judging who? You know, it's interesting. The data tells us that people are having less sex in the last 50 years than ever before. I don't think this is a good thing. I think it means it's not that people are embracing the Jesus teaching on chastity or whatever. I think what's happening is you have ways people are connecting through pornography, through other means where there's no actual commitment required. It's the effect on the digital age for digital natives. People don't know how to flirt anymore, let alone ask people on a date, how to have a conversation. Like, our culture is in serious crisis. And I think this shift really is the canary in the coal mine. In other words, it's the signal of something that's far deeper, the brokenness that happens from sex gone awry. And so I think it's fair to say that there is a staggering amount of pain or wounding, there's abuse, anger, violence, dysfunction, fear, regret, and shame that comes when sex goes wrong and is outside the context of its original design. Which, by the way, God's great design. He designed sex for procreation, for pleasure, to be a good and beautiful thing within a marriage. But what happens is so often God's beautiful gifts become distorted. And if we're honest, even people in this room, we all carry with us our own baggage, some kind of deep pain, whether that's divorce. Maybe your parents were divorced. Maybe you've experienced divorce. Infidelity, a parent leaving, insecurity, body shame, porn addiction, attachment disorder, if nothing, sort of a body insecurity from scrolling Instagram, right? I think our culture's attempt in the last half of century to uncouple sex from family, marriage, gender, and even people is naive at best to think there won't be massive consequences. But here's the other side of it, and that's that our sexuality is a good and beautiful gift. And this isn't new to Christians. They've always struggled with this. And so if you are here today and you are struggling both, maybe even with your sexuality, or maybe you're struggling with how to think about your sexuality, I just want you to know that you're not alone. And the church should be a safe place to be able to process these things together as a community. Whether that's your sexuality, your sexual orientation, your sense of gender, with our culture, your relationship that relationships that you're in, what your peers say to you, what you think about gay marriage, whatever it is, if you're here and you're struggling through that, welcome. You're in good company. You're not alone. I think many of us struggle with these things, but don't always say them out loud. And so, with all that, again, I just want to name this again. I want to be very clear and yet full of grace and compassion, because this is a hard conversation to have, because it really touches, I think, places that are really deep within our soul. Whether that's loneliness, the loneliness of being single, whether that's body image, confusion, lust, desire, self-control, father wounds, mother wounds, attachment, and really, ultimately, our identity itself. You know, the unique things to being a follower of Jesus is that your primary identity is not found in the things of this world. So it is not found in your sexuality, in your gender, in your ethnicity or race or even political alignment. And even though those things are certainly a part of us, they're not the most important thing. And our primary identity is rooted in Jesus and his community. With that, sexuality is such a core part of what it means to be human. And so whether you're single, married, gay, straight, all of that, it very much matters to who you are, what you think and believe, and how we process the world. And I think that's why the enemy targets it in the way that he does, because that's our deepest vulnerability. It's why in the New Testament, it says, they who sin sexually sin against their own body. There's real gravity to that. And when sexuality goes south, it creates a lot of pain. And so here's my point. I know this is a hard conversation, and I want to come at it with a ton of sensitivity and compassion, but I also don't want to look away from the hard teachings of Jesus. And so if you look at the scriptures, Jesus is always subverting the dominant culture. I mean, he does this over and over again with his parables, right? He tells these stories not just to have a cute little moral at the end, but because they are going to cause people to rethink the way they think about the world. And long before sexuality was about morality, it was about anthropology and theology, which is just a way of saying that long before it was about right and wrong, right, it was about what it means to be human. And so here's what Jesus does. And I want to look at Matthew 19's account because I think it frames this up in a real clear way for us. It says, some Pharisees came to test him, and they asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce for any and every reason? And notice, it's a genuine question. It's not a genuine question. Like they're trying to test him. Believe the right thing or we will shame you. And in Jewish culture, divorce was all over the place. It was a patriarchal culture, so divorce really benefited men. And then Jesus is asked this question, and in verse 4, he gives a remarkable reply. He says, haven't you read that at the beginning, the Creator made them male and female, and said, for this reason, a man will leave their father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Fascinating that in one sentence, Jesus makes the claim on gender, marriage, and family, right? All things that are very much confusing in our culture today. And then he retells the story of Genesis, and he advocates for women, which goes against the culture of the time. And so I think in doing so, what I want to do, maybe will help us understand this on a deeper level, is to lay next to each other the secular reality, if we're to truly buy the secular view of this, versus what I believe are the teachings of Jesus in the scripture. Here's the secular view, that human beings are animals. We're apes with time and chance on our side. Human nature is what it is. And there's no meaning or soul or purpose to our bodies other than survival and evolutionary progress, right? We're trying to survive. We'll do what we need to do so. Male and female, sex, gender, it's all just plumbing, right? Gender is a social construct, meaning it's something we created. Right? It's not real. It's oppressive, and sex is just kind of play for grown-ups. It's a biological release. And love is a feeling of happiness you get from being with another person or your desire for another person. And because marriage is a social construct, monogamy is not natural. It's not natural to be with one person. We're like animals. We should have as many mates as possible, whatever makes you happy. Because love is the feeling of happiness. And the purpose of marriage then becomes happiness. And if your marriage is great and you're happy, good. But if it's not great, That's fine. Find another one. And divorce becomes this enlightened decision between two people who are no longer compatible or who fall out of love, because ultimately love's about your happiness anyway. The Bible, it's just a collection of human writings with some good ideas, some good stories, but it's also full of sexism, racism, bigotry, and it's anti-sex and all of that. And the overall meaning of life, well, your truth is your truth. What you believe to be true, that is true. And basically, your happiness is determined by when and where you were born and how much money you have. This is the attempt to put language to the cultural pull without God. And I would argue that this is a narrative, but I don't believe it's a true narrative. Let me give you another narrative. Human beings were made in the image of God. Yes, we're like animals, but we are more like God than we are like apes. Because what separates us from animals is not just our IQ and hand dexterity. It's the fact that we have what the Bible calls a spirit or a soul. It's the thing that makes you immaterial. It's the immaterial parts of you, that your will, your fear, your longing, your desire, your pain, love, hate, forgiveness, compassion. It's invisible, but it's what makes us human. We're not a coincidence. We're not just a random science explosion, right? We are creation. The second is that humans were created in the image of God, but our nature is broken through sin. And so we were created not the way we were created to be. Things are different. Things happen when sin entered the picture. Although we have worth and dignity because God created us, whether you were born with an incredible IQ, whether you have a great physical body, or whether you were born with severe handicaps, disabilities, right? Physical ailments, you were born with a limp. Regardless, you are a good creation because God created you with worth. And yet, in all of us, we recognize that there's something broken. The third is that you were created male and female, that God designed your body and he made you male or female, that your maleness and your femaleness are blessed according to Genesis. And look, I spent 10 years in youth ministry. I've had enough really hard conversations with teens who were in agony because they wrestled with gender dysphoria. They wrestled with their gender. That's a real thing. And I know full well the pain that comes when your psychology and your biology do not line up. Like, that's a really hard thing. And I know what it's like to have to feel this secret shame, or even talking to students who felt like they're wrestling with their sexuality in other ways and having to come out to their parents or whatever that looks like. I know there's so much pain and brokenness there. So I say this with so much compassion, that for those of you, maybe even in this room, who struggle with that, or if you know someone who struggles with that, just know that we recognize that that's hard, that's painful. But that doesn't change the reality of what we see in Jesus' teaching. It's that according to the scriptures, God created male and female. And number 4, men and women are created equal in essence. We take this for granted. I think we think about feminism, we often associate with like a leftist ideology, but the reality is this. I mean, Jesus very much did a lot of things for women who were being really genuinely oppressed. So I'm not talking about like gender pay gap. I'm talking like it was very, very challenging to be a woman in that culture. And there are places today where that exists, where it is extraordinarily difficult. And my point is that men and women were created equal in dignity, equal in worth, and yet distinct in creation. Meaning you can't separate design from function. Women were created for childbearing, to feed children uniquely. Men's bodies were created to protect, to hunt. This isn't just a social construct. This is a biological reality. And there isn't a single social scientist worth their salt who's arguing otherwise. And most of them are secular, but they're not arguing that. And so I think it's important to name those realities. Number 5 is that the scriptures have a high view of sex. When two people have sex, it's about babies, it's about pleasure, but it's more than that. It's more than just an exchange. The Hebrew word ahad means when two humans becoming one, it's not just two bodies, but it's two souls. You know, there's new science on this recently that they did a study on attachment theory, that when a sexually active couple breaks up, the same parts of the brain that light up when someone breaks a bone light up in them, meaning there is a deep sadness and pain that happens in that separation. And so inside of marriage, there's this beautiful, beautiful way in which God has designed that to take place. But outside of marriage, it can be destructive and dehumanizing. And I believe that Christians have a higher view. And we don't just think it's recreation, but it's a union. It's a covenant promise and a marriage that says, look, no matter what happens, I'm not going anywhere. You may get sick. You may no longer be able to move the way you once could move. Something may happen, but I'm not leaving. I'm committed because what our marriage is built on is a covenant, not an emotion or a feeling. Number 6, love is more than an emotion. It's more than lust. Tim Keller wrote this way, and I love this. He said, love is a decision of the heart. I love that line. A decision of the heart to delight in one another, soul, and to will their good ahead of your own, no matter the cost. Marriage is not a contract, it's covenant. It's committing. Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist and author, he writes about in one of his books, he writes about the myth of modern love. As I'm watching all these Disney movies with my daughter, I'm like, there's a lot of this in there, right? The myth of modern love is based on 4 assumptions. One myth is that true love is passionate love that never fades. One myth is that if you're in true love, you should marry that person. One myth is if your love ends, you should leave that person because it wasn't true love. And another myth is if you can find the right person, you will have true love forever. Haidt argues that this myth is biologically impossible. He said the human brain is not capable of generating a passion like that at best. And for most people, it's like it can last only 6 months. And yet, this is one of the deep-seated myths that we often are fed. It's funny, like my wife and I, when we were dating, we were kind of going through that whole process. There was a time where we broke up for like 7 days, and I was so miserable, I didn't eat for like 7 days. That's the only time in my life I've had a 6-pack. It's like, I was just working out and I was sad and I felt, then we got back together and we hung out every day for like a month. It was awesome, but that kind of intensity, not sustainable for a long-term marriage. I think all of us can point back to the honeymoon phase, the times when it was just so, you just wanted to be around your spouse all the time and you wanted to be with them. And now our marriage and our love is far more deep, foundational. It's different, right? But it's some ways it's even better. And that is the beauty of a marriage over time, is that your love grows far more deeply and foundational. It's bigger, it's better. Number 7, love is spiritually forming. It brings out the best and the worst in you. In the safe place of marriage, you can work out your stuff together. It was Gary Thomas who said, love is not only to make you happy, it's to make you holy. Right? There's a sanctifying process in marriage. And I will tell you, there is nobody who knows the best parts of me. But there's also nobody who knows the worst parts of me more than Betsy does. My bad habits, my insecurities, right? Whatever pedestal you have me on, if you could talk to her and it'll take you right down, right? And there's something beautiful in that. Because even though she knows the worst parts of me, she knows the deepest parts of me, the truth is you can't hide in a marriage. That stuff comes out. And yet she's continued to stay with me for 14 years, 14, 15, 13. I didn't have her in the first service to check me. So, yeah, okay. There's something profound in that. To see the worst in someone, to have to forgive the worst in somebody, and to still see the good and beautiful in somebody. That kind of sounds like the gospel. Number 8, divorce becomes the rupture of this. And there are times when a marriage dies, whether it's abuse, abandonment, infidelity, and there's just no way to save a marriage. And some of you know that pain very, very acutely. I've heard some of your stories. Number 9, the Bible is a library of divine and human writings. It's inspired by God. It's a story of God's redemption through Jesus. Has the Bible been abused? It has, by people. Does that mean that the Bible isn't authoritative? No. And so when the Bible is used well, it can help us experience what Jesus described as life to the full, the greater life that he calls us into. And at some point, you have to ask yourself the question of those two narratives, of the secular and the Christian narrative, which one do you believe? And here's what I know. After spending, I mentioned this earlier, a lot of time in youth ministry in a conservative church, in a conservative city, I know there is a whole lot of sexual brokenness underneath the surface. Sexual assault, abuse, people struggling with their gender, with their sexuality. Here's what I believe. I believe that the church should be a safe place to process what you are struggling with. And it breaks my heart that for so many, the church feels like a place where you need to hide. And so no matter how much you feel ostracized or judged, I just want you to know if you're wrestling with that, you belong here. And it's okay to not have it all figured out because Jesus wants all of you, even the messy parts of you. And I can say the same thing for your pastors. Like we care about you, mess and all, and we want to walk through things with you. And I'm sure you have questions like this whole sermon brings up a whole can of worms, and that's okay. Bring your questions. Like we want to process it with you in community. Let me close with two invitations. The first invitation is this. You are invited to be honest about your struggles. If you're dealing with the loneliness of being single, you're not alone. Let us walk with you in community. If you're divorced, your story's not over yet. You're not defined by your past. If your marriage is on the outs, don't go at it alone, right? Let us walk with you, encourage you, and pastor you through that. The worst thing you can do is suffer in silence. Like we are for you to thrive, and don't give up. I know that can seem like the easier way, but don't give up. Your marriage is worth fighting for. If you're currently in an adulterous relationship, and that's hidden, that relationship does not need to continue, and you can repent. And here's the thing. I can't promise that if you do that you can save your marriage. But I can tell you that I have walked with couples who have brought the darkness into the light. And on the other side of it, their marriage is far stronger, far richer, and far greater than it ever was when they were hiding. And so I think it's worth it because the opposite, right? Letting that thing go unchecked, it's going to be far, far worse and lead to far more ruin. Whatever it is you're wrestling with, whatever sexual brokenness you're wrestling with, just know this is a safe place. Let us walk with you because there is wholeness and healing in Jesus. The second invitation is this. You're invited to rethink what you believe about sex, gender, divorce, and put your faith in Jesus' vision for marriage. You know, I think that's one of the challenging things in our culture, like wrestling with what we believe on this stuff. And you may be hearing me talking, saying, man, I just disagree with you. And I want you to know, first of all, that's okay. I'm willing to walk with you and have conversations and disagree. But I just want to extend the invitation to consider Jesus' vision for it. Do you put your faith in the dominant cultural narrative? Do you put your faith in a podcast or in someone's Instagram feed? Where do you put your faith? And I would challenge you to consider the truth of the scriptures. And so as a faith community, let us work this out together in community with grace, with compassion, and with love. Will you pray with me? Lord, help us to understand these hard, challenging things and help us to do so with grace. I pray for anyone who's experienced abuse, trauma, sexual brokenness of any kind. I pray that there would be healing for them and that they would not feel like they are alone. And I pray for anyone who is wrestling with a difficult season of marriage. I pray right now, Lord, that there would be a work of your Spirit that would encourage them and empower them to say, this is not the end of our story, and to commit to finding the help and healing that's needed. And so, of all of us, Lord, let us build our life and our foundation on the teachings of your word and be obedient to your word, trusting in you every step of the way. Pray all these things for your beautiful name. Amen.